Hello and welcome to the Research 101 podcast series by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I am Jennifer Garner, outgoing chair of the Academy's Council on Research. This series will provide an overview of the research process and provide information on Academy research opportunities. You can earn 1.5 units of continuing professional education by listening to all 6. During the second podcast, I will be interviewing Dr. Sarah Johnson, who will share her advice on finding funding. Dr. Johnson is Assistant Professor and Director of the Functional Foods and Human Health Laboratory in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at Colorado State University. Her research program aims to examine the efficacy of nutrition and food-related interventions to improve chronic disease risk, primarily cardiovascular and metabolic disease, to evaluate underlying mechanisms by which nutrition and food-related interventions induce clinical responses, and to explore the bidirectional relationship between nutrition and food-related interventions and food systems as they relate to human health and sustainability. She is chair of the Evidence-Based Practice Committee and is a member of the Academy's Council on Research. Dr. Johnson, thank you for sharing your time and experience with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So my first question for you is, one of the primary barriers that members often cite in terms of conducting research is accessing the funds to do so. So what advice in general do you have for members looking to fund their research ideas?
So first, I think it's really important to understand the existing challenges that make it difficult to get funding to support our research. For one, federal funding for nutrition research has historically been limited and is increasingly becoming more limited and competitive to obtain. And so this makes alternative funding opportunities that much more important, but also highly competitive. Two, regarding these alternative funding opportunities, one of the major funding sources is from industry. And this can be a great source of funding, particularly for pilot projects and gathering preliminary data to support larger federal funded opportunities. However, this also brings about the issue related to perception of industry bias, and I know that that's a controversial area, particularly in the field of nutrition and dietetics. Another challenge is that funding bodies tend to have their own set of priorities, so they might have specific goals and objectives that they want to achieve within their organization, and so they often prefer to fund research that helps them to achieve these goals in sort of directions that they want to go in. So these sort of areas that they prefer to fund sometimes don't necessarily match the types of research that we want to do on an individual basis, but also those of the field in general. So in view of this information, I think it's really important to have several things in mind. One is that we need to be creative and resourceful. And so funding is definitely a challenge to get, but that doesn't mean it's an unachievable challenge. So, going above and beyond outside of your comfort zone and utilizing resources, I think, is one of the most important steps to obtaining funding. In terms of looking for grant opportunities, there are certain search engines that we can utilize to find grant opportunities like Pivot. However, this is a paid search engine, so this might only be available to individuals and institutions that have a subscription for that service. There's also grants.gov, which is a free way to look at grant opportunities through the government. But aside from those, even just using standard internet searches through Google, I actually do this every day in my position. Well, not every day, but pretty close. So when I'm looking for funding opportunities, sometimes I want to think outside of the box a little bit. I can just go into Google and do an internet search, put in key terms of the population of interest, the food or the nutrition-related intervention, several key terms that can help me to sort of identify where those opportunities might be, and I've come across numerous funding opportunities that I would not have found otherwise. It's also important to identify funding opportunities with a research focus that matches yours. So to do this, you can go on the website and or talk with the individual that sort of oversees that grant opportunity and determine what the goals of the organization are, what types of research and outcomes that they're interested in pursuing, and if that sort of aligns with yours. You can also review previously funded research, not always, but often, which may be listed on the website, or you can speak with the administrator overseeing that funding opportunity, and that will give you insight into whether or not your research sort of falls into the types of research that they're looking to fund. Along these lines, you can also have a conversation with the person overseeing the grant opportunity to discuss your research ideas with them, but you can also often submit a letter of intent, which might even be as short as 1 page or a half of a page, and this is sort of a well-designed, brief overview of the research that you have in mind, and they can provide feedback on that as to whether it falls in line with their research or potential ways to modify it to have it fall more in line with their goals and objectives. And one of the most important things that we have control over is how we write grants. So we need to determine ways that we can improve our grant writing. So that's one particular thing that we have the most control over. And one way that I've done this over the years is to find mentors that can sort of guide me in grant writing, in hypothesis generation, data collection, all of those things, but they can also review my grants from a reviewer's perspective and provide feedback that can help me to make it more competitive and sort of try to close all the gaps that might exist in that proposal. We can also collaborate with individuals not only in our field, but also outside of our field with physicians or biomedical scientists, food scientists, et cetera, to really strengthen our grant proposal and have that interdisciplinary approach. And that sort of, along with that, we can consider novel approaches. So we want whatever we're proposing in our grant proposal to be novel. So we don't want it to be the same or too similar to what other people are doing. So we can be novel in our methodology. We can be novel in our outcomes being assessed. We can be novel in the nutrition and food-related intervention that we're proposing. There are numerous ways to be novel as to how we go about it. Another important aspect is to not be overly ambitious. And when I first started out writing grant proposals, I was extremely overly ambitious, and I think most young investigators sort of start out this way. And so just especially with your first grant proposal, you want to think about what can I afford to do, what do I have time to do, and can I actually accomplish this in the time allotted for conducting the project. You should also read reviewer criteria. And so by going over the reviewer criteria, it's sort of a checklist of what they're going to evaluate when they read over your grant proposal. And this is really important because you can make sure that you're meeting all of their expectations and that you're addressing all of that. And similarly, following all proposal directions very closely, that's very important, and also using their language. So if they use specific terms within the request for proposals or on their website or anything like that, if you can use that to your advantage, then you're sort of speaking on their level. And most importantly, I would say don't give up and be persistent. Grant proposal rejection happens to everyone in research at some point. And I think we hear a lot more no's than we do yeses. But if you stay persistent, resubmit your proposal. You might have feedback on your proposal. You might have comments that you can utilize to improve the quality of your research. These are all things that can actually be beneficial. So keep submitting, resubmit your grant, don't give up. And aside from the grant funding, I think it's important too to consider ways that you can leverage resources in your position and or your organization or elsewhere. So for example, does the organization that you work for, it could be a hospital, it could be another setting, do they have a foundation that you could approach to potentially receive some small funds to do some of the research? Or could you utilize other existing resources within your position and or your organization such that you're sort of providing an in-kind contribution without necessarily needing extra funds? And lastly with this, being involved in Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics research opportunities, so getting involved in systematic reviews and other opportunities is a good way to get your feet wet in terms of research without necessarily needing grant funds.
Wow, that was incredible, Sarah. That's a lot of great advice, and what I'm really coming away with is this, for our listeners who have listened to both part 1 and now part 2, this importance of planning ahead and finding mentors, talking through your plan, getting feedback, and most importantly, being realistic with what you can do. So I think you've just really outlined a lot of really important strategies for anyone listening. And I'm wondering, our listeners probably represent a wide variety of career stages. So what advice do you have for someone who may be a student trying to find grant opportunities versus someone who's maybe starting their career as a dietitian in a clinical or outpatient setting, because there's also opportunities through the Academy and other organizations that our members might be a part of. So could you speak to some more specific sources of funding that you've used or that you would recommend people looking into?
Absolutely. So graduate students in particular, through the university that they attend, often there are graduate student organizations, so there might be an organization that's a student-run organization. There's also usually a graduate school within the university that oversees graduate students. These often have some sort of grant opportunities that might be related to funding a master's project or a dissertation project. Some of them can be as small as a couple $100s to several $1,000s. So definitely being resourceful and looking at opportunities within your university is helpful. Additionally, certain departments, colleges, and universities have funding opportunities as well. And those can be for graduate students and or for clinicians and professors and staff. So often these different levels within the university provide some sort of pilot grant opportunities. So for example, at Colorado State University, we have pilot grant opportunities at the college level, but we also have larger pilot grant opportunities at the university level as well. And so those are really helpful for generating pilot data that can support larger grants, but also in supporting student research as well. And for individuals in hospitals and in other settings, sometimes, in particular in hospitals, they might have opportunities for obtaining research dollars that are handled through their central administration. Sometimes it might not be publicly known, and sometimes you can, sort of make an internal request, similarly through a foundation for a hospital, etc. Sometimes just asking can take you a long way. There's also opportunities outside of these organizations, so you can look to your state government. So often they do provide funds for nutrition and food-related research it could be related to health outcomes, it could be related to health promotion and public health. There's also foundations, there sometimes are private donors that will provide funds, and then industry as well. So looking at food commodity boards or specific companies sometimes are willing to provide funds to support research.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. That was a really great summary of both the key concepts to keep in mind and key strategies, but also a lot of different, it sounds like there's a lot of different mechanisms by which individuals can be funded, and you did a great job of outlining all of those. So I just want to thank you so much for being a part of this series and sharing all of your expertise and experience with us.
Thank you.